What is going on, alpha males? Welcome to the Alpha Male Podcast, the podcast where we talk about what it means to be a man the right way, strong, made in the image of God, and don't apologize, making godly men strong and making strong men godly. The guns of World War III. I debated for quite some time about whether to put this on the Alpha Male Podcast or Gunfighter Life. But I think if World War III actually breaks out, a lot of you men that have never picked up a gun before probably will. So I reckoned that Alpha Male Podcast is where this one's going to go out. To start the intro, first and foremost, I'm a servant of God. So let me be clear, I don't want another war. I have spent a big chunk of my adult life fighting in one way or another for this country. As you hear in the bio, did a couple of tours in Iraq. I served in 2 branches of the armed forces and also here domestically as the commander of a team to stop active shooters. I would be happy to never be another battlefield or gunfight again. I want peace, but I prepare for war. That being said, today is going to come from mostly an infantryman's perspective, as my primary in both branches was infantry. I focus on small arms, meaning rifles, pistols. I'm not going to get into like tanks and aircraft or anything like that. The guns of World War III, if it breaks out tomorrow, next week. I know we have a lot of international listeners. I know that there's a lot of international listeners, and I'm humbled and blessed because of that. I also know that most of the listeners are here in America. So, because the last 2 world wars were not really fought on American soil, doesn't mean World War III won't be. Keep that in mind as we get into the guns of World War III. Who am I? A question we should all ask ourselves. I am, first and foremost, a servant of God, made in His very own image, a follower of Jesus Christ, a simple man called by God to the Great Commission to share the good news of Jesus Christ. Next, a little bit about my background and what God has allowed me to do and bless me to do in life. Grew up what most would consider very poor in the backwoods of the southeastern and mid-Atlantic United States, hunting and fishing. Joined the Marine Corps at 17. Did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. So a decorated Marine Corps combat veteran. Infantry assaultman. After the combat tours, I was an urban warfare instructor for the United States Marine Corps under Mojave Viper. I also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. Also a veteran of law enforcement. I served with LAPD. I was a sworn peace officer, a cop for LAPD. I worked regular patrol assignments and more specialized assignments. One of those more specialized assignments was warrant service, fugitive recovery. Also had some other law enforcement roles. I am an FBI certified firearms instructor and been certified by another 3-letter government agency in a lot of firearms and training things. I've also been a private contractor, worked in the private sector pertaining to tactics and gunfighting and protecting America from enemies foreign and domestic. I served as the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters in a large metropolitan area. That was our primary mission, to stop active shooters, which sadly are a thing in America today. I've also been blessed to do quite a bit of competition shooting. Started my first formal competitions Even before joining the Marine Corps at 17, I had won more shooting competitions than I can remember. I have competed in all manner of disciplines in shooting. I've been blessed to be a state rifle and pistol champion, West Coast regional champion. Like I said, been blessed to win more shooting competitions than I can remember. Mentioned hunting. I've hunted to put meat on the table starting when I was a child. I've also been a professional big game hunter and guide, hunting and slaying all manner of beast. And I don't apologize for that. Humbled to be the host of 3 podcasts. Simple Man Sermons, Alpha Male Podcast, and Gunfighter Life. Obviously, as things not mentioned, I've been blessed to do many other things. But, again, first and foremost, I'm a servant of God, a believer and follower of the Bible, the Word, Jesus Christ. And I don't apologize for that. With that, let's transition into today's topic. I want to thank me for any of that service. Easy, free way to do that, and if you like the podcast, honestly, is to like and subscribe to the podcast. Scroll down and hit some stars if you're listening on iTunes or Spotify. Anyway, with that being said, I'm going to start off with what I know best. The guns that we use here in America, and a lot of our allies use too, but the fighting small arms of the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Army, again, from the bios which I served in both. Now, the larger force, the U.S. Army, primarily M4s, or one variation or model designation of or another. I know that there are still quite a bit of M16A2s in service in armories, as I have seen them firsthand. Likely in World War III, many of those will get pulled out. I know that we just officially adopted the M5, but the idea of any number of those seeing the battlefield if war breaks out tomorrow or next week is relatively low, as historically, and there are some exceptions as Germany in World War II, but historically when an army goes to war, they fight with the weapons that they have and they have tested and already have an inventory. You may see some special forces guys or something running around with an M5, the SIG, 227 Fury, but very little, if any, of that. Most of what you're going to see for the U.S. Army is primarily, right now, the M4, which is a primarily 30-round magazine, box magazine fed, shoulder-fired assault rifle that fires 5.56 62 grain light armor piercing ammunition. That's probably what would be fielded if it was fielded tomorrow, next week, if World War III were to break out. It has a 16-inch barrel, which is the primary difference between it and the U.S. Marine Corps counterpart. The U.S. Marine Corps primarily still fields, I believe they do, as when I was in and when I got out, I was issued an M16A2, which I'm sure they have many of still, but their primary arm for the infantry is the M16A4. It has a flat top upper, meaning that you can easily mount an optic on it. I've been blessed by God to be a very good marksman, was an expert rifleman in the Marine Corps, and as such, was an early recipient of the ACOG, which I believe they still use, and it is a fine optic. So that's a primary difference. I believe that almost everybody in the Marine Corps infantry, at least, now has those. And also, the Marines are big on rifle marksmanship. You were expected with iron sights in my day to hit man-sized targets with iron sights at 500 meters. With that M16A2 and then later M16A4. And again, the primary difference between the Marine Corps fighting rifle and the Army's M4 is a 20-inch barrel. That's going to give you more velocity if you're not a gun nerd. It's going to give you a little bit more velocity and a little bit more power. It's also going to be heavier. So it really depends on what you're doing. Are we fighting, on the Siberian Russian steppe with vast open spaces? Or are we fighting the battle for Denver? Are we fighting the battle for Portland in the Pacific Northwest in an urban environment? It really depends. As much as I love the Marine Corps and they have the reputation for being a formidable fighting force, and they are, it's not because, and it has never been because their equipment is the best. So they have a good rifle for long-range marksmanship. You might argue it's not as good as just a regular old M4 for urban warfare, and it really depends on what you're going to be doing. I did a couple of tours in Iraq. The kind of warfare that I saw was very different from the battlefields of Afghanistan. Another big difference that should be noted is the U.S. Marine Corps standardized on the Magpul PMags, a civilian magazine that was adopted by the Marine Corps, I think, very wisely. That's always been one of the major causes of malfunctions, is crappy, old, beat-up metal magazines. And they get bent and they get misshapen. And they tend to cause a lot of malfunctions, a lot more than PMags. I think that was a genius move on the Marine Corps' part, going to PMags. They're polymer mags, and a lot of old school people think that polymer is less than metal. But in the case of an AR magazine, I will take a PMag all day long over an old USGI issued magazine by Circle K or Colt or whoever made them. I would take a PMag all day long. So that's a major step up for the Marine Corps. I think that alone will cut down on malfunctions. Just the fact that they have the PMags when the Army is still running the USGI metal mags to whoever makes them to the cheapest bidder. I should note that it's pretty standard that both the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Army infantryman is going to have fairly substantial body armor. And you may think this is a plus, but I don't know that it's always a plus, because you get that firepower versus mobility. And a lot of times you get weighed down with so much stuff, you're kind of like a tactical turtle. You're kind of just shuffling around trying to get from one place to another. You can't do it very quickly. Get some spry young Afghan warrior that's not weighed down by anything. He has an AK with 2 mags, and he can sprint and run and take cover. And although he might not have body armor, he can sure run and duck behind a rock real quick. Whereas the American Marine or Army infantry can't really do that, no matter how strong they are, because they have so much weight on them. But that is something to consider, that we will likely, depending on how long the war goes on, at least for the initial part, have all of our infantry, whether Marine Corps or Army, outfitted with level 4 body armor. The handguns for the U.S. We did recently adopt the M16, and they are seeing service, although I think a lot of the troops will still end up with the Beretta 92. Honestly, if you offered me either one, I'd be hard-pressed between the two. I think the Beretta 92 is by far the best combat handgun ever issued, period. I've done a whole episode on that. You can listen to it on Gunfighter Life. The M17 is a fine weapon. Sadly, a lot of the 92s in service are so beat up and so old. That's why I said it was a toss-up. If it was a brand new version of each, I'd take a Beretta 92. Both are semi-automatic 9mm Parabellum handguns, holding somewhere between 15 and 17 rounds. The extra couple of rounds really isn't going to make much of a difference. The M17, also the M18, which is the compact version. Either one of those is able to take an optic. Whether those are actually issued, I have never actually seen one yet in military service on any regular infantry unit or anything like that, or even cavalry unit. I haven't seen an optic on a handgun. I'm sure the more specialized guys have them. I haven't seen them. But the M17, M18 can take an optic, which if you're armed with a handgun is a big deal. The primary difference is there's a couple of big differences. One being the material. The M17 is primarily polymer, whereas the 92 is steel and aluminum. The M17 M18 is a striker-fired system, with a simpler system with a consistent trigger pull. The Beretta 92 is a double single, which means it has a heavy first trigger pull and a light, crisp additional trigger pulls. I won't really get into that because we'll go down a whole rabbit hole. But both handguns are quite effective, and for the purposes of this podcast, they are semi-automatic, magazine-fed 9mm parabellums that hold between 15 and 17 rounds. And that is going to be... Now, I must mention, sadly, that the bayonet training, I believe, was taken out of basic training for the Army. Now, I went to Marine Corps basic training, and when I transitioned to the Army, they don't make you go through basic training again, thankfully. However, the Army, I do believe, got rid of bayonet training. Although I think if World War III breaks out, they'll quickly realize that may have been short-sighted and reissue bayonets and give some training. The Marine Corps very much is all about bayonet training. It's a good tradition, I believe. It's good for aggression and has a lot of martial applicability even on modern battlefields. The Marines are known for the fighting K-bar, of which I carried in Iraq, and I also carried the new version of the Marine Corps bayonet, which I forget the designation for that, but the new version of the Marine Corps bayonet is probably one of the most formidable fighting knives and bayonets I have seen. It is a fine piece of kit. With that, the force that I know the most about, the one that I served in, let's transition to the one I know the least about because I think it's the most secretive. And that is China. I don't think you can deny that if World War III breaks out, China is going to be a formidable force. They are a huge nation and they field a huge land army. And I want to dispel something right off the bat. I often think of Chinese stuff as cheap. Well, not so with weapons. Stuff that China makes for us to buy on Amazon or whatever, yeah, that's probably pretty cheap most of the time. But like firearms that China makes for themselves historically have been very good. Norinco AKs, Norinco SKSs, they're good weapons. I believe Norinco is who still makes their domestic infantry rifle. And I had to look this one up because China is pretty secretive. The QBZ95, and I'm going to read from Wikipedia, so take that for what it's worth, but I'll give credit where credit is due. The Type 95 automatic rifle is a bullpup assault rifle designed and manufactured by Norinco and issued since 1995. So it's a pretty new service weapon. Much newer, I should point out, than our M16 and M4s, which are pretty much a direct lineage of a 1950s rifle, if not heavily modernized. But 1995, the People's Liberation Army. It's a bullpup style rifle, which if you don't know, if you're not a gun nerd, that means basically it's not your traditional rifle. The magazine goes towards the back, towards the stock where your shoulder is, which gives the ability to have a long, full rifle length barrel and a short handy package. Remember how we talked about the Marine Corps' M16A4 versus the Army's M4, and one has a 20-inch barrel and one has a 16-inch barrel? One's better for long range and one's better for urban warfare and CQB stuff, close quarters battle. Well, the bullpup kind of does both of those at the same time. It gives you a long barrel, but it shoves the barrel back farther against the body, so you get a long barrel and a short overall package. That's the idea of the bullpup. Problem with most bullpups is the ergonomics. Now, if you grew up in China and there's no, Second Amendment, they're not probably running around hunting and stuff as peasants in China or as citizens in China, whatever title you want to give them. That might be the only rifle they've ever picked up is that bullpup that they're issued and they train with. So for them, it may not be an issue. And this is such a secretive weapon. I don't know anybody in the West that has one, that has tested one, that has shot one. But I know historically, Norinco makes good weapons. The Norinco SKS is a fine weapon. And the Norinco AKs are good weapons. And it wouldn't be outside the realm of possibility, even though they tout this new rifle. If World War III breaks out, they will be arming large numbers of conscripts with the older AKs and the older SKSs, which are still formidable fighting weapons. The AK-47 short rabbit hole is by far the most common, I think, battlefield rifle of the 20th century, and it would be almost unthinkable that you wouldn't see it on the battlefields of World War III. It has been produced and used by so many nations and produced in such quantity, it would be hard to imagine that it didn't show up on a battlefield. But back to the QBZ-95, it fires a cartridge that is also very secretive, but I was able to find some info, assuming the info is right and it's not Chinese disinformation. But if we take off our tinfoil hats and assume that the information on this cartridge is true, the 5.8 millimeter by 42, and it's got a bunch of different loads listed. To me, a ballistics nerd, looks to be a little bit better if you just look at the raw numbers than our 5.56 NATO. And I say that as, somebody that's proudly served America and gone to war to defend this country. If I'm just looking at math and ballistics, again, if this is true information and not like Chinese disinformation, it's a better round, it looks like, ballistically. It's got a heavier projectile, going faster than, let's say, our M4, which is what I'll compare it to. It lists a 64 grain at 3,100 feet a second, which is slightly heavier than our main projectile at just a little bit under velocity. I'm a big heavy bullet guy when I can get it, so I like that. And they're 77 grain, which is almost exactly what kind of our elite units use, at 2,900 feet a second, which is no slouch. That is a good velocity. That is a good weight round. So that round, assuming it's manufactured well and produced well and is reliable, looks like a fine cartridge. And again, it's pretty secretive, so don't take that as truth. By the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter is established, and I know no first-hand witness for the destructive capability of the 5.8 by 42. But it seems to be a pretty legit cartridge, and from what I know of older Norinco rifles, it seems like it would be a decent rifle. Don't discount China and write them off with like propaganda saying the stuff they make is junk. The stuff they make for us is largely junk. The stuff they make for their own army is probably not. So don't be naive. So let's talk about the other big player likely in W.W.3. Russia. And I'm not getting into politics, who's right and who's wrong. I'm strictly talking today about the weapons of World War III. If New York and LA are smoking nuclear wastelands and you find yourself on the battlefields, for the Battle of Oklahoma City, what are the Russians armed with? Well, we talked about the AK, and that is, whatever you want to think about Russia or politics, the AK-47 is almost undeniably the quintessential battlefield rifle of the 20th century. It is rugged, it is reliable, it's a historic cartridge. The 7.62x39 is phenomenal. And again, likely if Russia goes to World War III, many of their troops will still be armed with the older variants of the AK-47. They switched quite some time ago to the AK-74 and now the AK-12, which are in 5.45x39, which is much more akin to the 2 cartridges we talked about thus far. Much more akin to the 5.56mm NATO than we'd like to admit, and probably very akin to the 4.8 that we talked about. A high velocity, small caliber cartridge. I think it's a good cartridge. I like the geometry of that cartridge. It looks like, from what I know about guns, and I know a little bit, that it looks like it would feed very smoothly in a platform that already is known for reliability. It's a very tapered cartridge, which has some advantages. It has a steel case to our brass case ammunition, which may not seem like a big deal, but it's lighter per round, both because the projectiles are lighter and because the case itself is lighter. So if you're, again, we talk about that firepower versus mobility, pound for pound, or ruble for ruble, or whatever metric you want to use, magazine per magazine, their kit's going to be lighter on that front, at least. I think the rifle is slightly heavier, the AK-12. In fact, let us turn to the AK-12, and then we'll revisit this cartridge. So the AK-12, the Russians' new infantry weapon, chambered in 5.45 by 39, designed and manufactured by Kalashnikov concern, formerly Izmash, which historically also has been known for making fine weapons. In service 2018. Now again, this is an iteration of an older weapon, the AK-47, which came out in the 40s. It's very modernized looking. It looks like it has an optics capable rail on top. Whether or not they field optics on their go-to infantry weapons, I cannot say. And it's actually not as heavy as I thought, 7.72 pounds, which is not that heavy. I think that's probably lighter than the M16A4 with an ACOG. So their weapon's going to be fairly handy, and their ammunition is going to be fairly light and handy. I'm just going to briefly recap the 5.56s, which is what we use and NATO uses to a large degree. That generally is going to be a 62 grain projectile. And the velocity is going to vary depending on whether you're shooting it out of a 16-inch barrel or a 20-inch barrel. But just to give you a rough idea, just for a rough number, let's say 62 grains at 2,800 feet a second. And we're looking at the Russian 5.45 by 39, which is going 53 grains at 2,900. So slightly less powerful. It also looks like they have a few different grain weights going up to 57 grains. Hardened steel core, which is pretty akin to what we're going to be shooting. And the M855 or new derivative thereof. And that's 57 grains at 2,900. Again, they're all in the same ballpark as far as ballistics go. I will point out that since its inception and introduction, which I believe we first encountered on the battlefields of Afghanistan back when we were arming the Afghans, which in retrospect, anyway, I won't go down that rabbit hole. When we were arming and on the side of the Afghan people fighting against Russia and arming them to fight Russia, I think that's where we first encountered and got stories of the 5.45 by 39, and it had a reputation for being a very nasty wounding round. And I think it deserves that reputation. It is a nasty round. I'm not going to say good or bad on that. A round is designed to do damage. Armies are designed to kill people and break stuff. Like, that is kind of the point of an infantry in an army if they're needed. Hopefully they're not needed, but when they are, it's kind of what they're for, right? Now, the Russian service pistol, and I do realize I forgot the Chinese service pistol. I'll go back to that. But the Russian service pistol, not really much different, it doesn't seem, than the American. You know, it's a magazine-fed 9mm Parabellum. So same cartridge as us. Looks like a very similar design. Maybe the aesthetics are slightly different. Granted, it's a pretty ugly gun, but I bet it works well if the Russians made it and designed it and issued it to their military. 17-round detachable box magazine. The MP443. Apparently they made or make, or at one time made, a civilian version for import. If anybody has an experience with this, I'd love for you to write in here about whether it's a good pistol or not. If the Russians feel that it's probably very reliable as far as the ergonomics and shootability, that I wouldn't bet on one way or another. But as far as ballistics and capability go, it's very similar to what we issue. And the QSZ92, going back, this is the Chinese People's Liberation Army sidearm. It actually doesn't look too bad. It looks kind of good. I hate to admit it. It's a good looking pistol. Actually looks better than the Russian one. Design 1994. It lists two cartridges, the 5.8 by 21 and the 9 Parabellum. So the 9 Parabellum one lists with a 15-round magazine. Again, that's pretty close to ours. And it says 20 rounds in the 5.8 by 21. And to do a dive into the 5.8 by 21 is a Chinese armor-piercing cartridge for handguns and submachine guns. And it lists a 46 grain at 1,570 feet a second. And a 46 grain armor-piercing at 1,700 feet a second. Now that is not at all like our handgun or the Russian handgun. That's quite a bit different. If those numbers, again, by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, I don't know if those numbers are true. I don't know if they've been substantiated. But if I look at that on its face, that is in its own ballpark. You might think of the 5.7, but looking at those numbers, that's far different. The 5.7, you're talking like a 27 grain bullet. This is a 46 grain bullet. I believe a heavy bullet for the 5.7 is 40 grains. This is a 46 grain armor piercing at 1,700 feet a second and a 20 round magazine. So I'd hate to admit it, but pistol for pistol, assuming that pistol works well, it's going to have less recoil, and it appears that it'll have more firepower than either ours or the Russian standard issue infantry pistol. So, maybe hats off to them for that pistol. Again, who knows how it shoots, who knows how it handles. The picture of it that they have, it looks like a decent modern design pistol, but without disassembling it or shooting it or training with one, I don't know. The sights on it look pretty crude, so I might not be able to take advantage of the long-range capability of what that cartridge probably offers with those kind of sights, if that picture is in fact correct. But a pretty cool pistol, the QSZ-92, and it lists 2 calibers, so I don't know if the military uses one and the police use another one. A lot of countries have quasi-paramilitary police. It's not so much like the U.S. You spent time even in Europe, which is very Western. They have a much more militarized police force in general than we do, with the exception of the British. They don't even carry guns most of the time, which I can't even really wrap my head around that, as I don't even like taking the dog to go to the bathroom outside without carrying a gun. But whatever. Let's rewind from that rabbit hole. I assume, looking at these 2 cartridges, that maybe the military gets issued the one and the law enforcement side gets issued the other, although I am just purely speculating on that. I have no hard evidence for that whatsoever. It just seems like if it's listed in both cartridges, that might be the case. Now, who knows how W.W.3 hopefully never happens, but if it does happen soon, who knows how it will shake out with allies and whatever, but I have to assume that the British will be on our side, as they have historically been in 2 world wars, although Russia was on our side in 2 world wars, and now they may not be. But the British have a quite distinct weapon. It uses the same cartridge as we do, the 5.56x45 NATO, as the name suggests. It's a NATO country, and so are we. Same round, the SA-80. Let's Wikipedia this bad girl and see what's up. It says it's an L85 rifle variant. From what I've heard, and I've never shot an L85, they didn't have the best reputation out of the gate. But, I mean, to be fair, the M16 in Vietnam didn't have the best reputation out of the gate, and it's become a fine service weapon. So let's not hold that against it. The SA-80, it is a bullpup. Remember, we talked about that in the beginning, much like China is fielding, or allegedly fielding. It might be all Russian or Chinese disinformation. They may be fielding space laser guns in a 40-watt range, for all I know. But taking that at face value, it is a bullpup weapon. It's, I believe, a Stanag mag, which means it should take the same magazines as our rifles take, either the USGI metal ones or the PMags or something akin to that. 30-round magazine fed 5.56 bullpup, gas operated rotating bolt. I do believe that their standard infantry weapons, even way back when we ran into them in Iraq, way back when the war started, I believe their go-to weapons had optics, even though ours didn't. Like when the war started and I was waiting to invade Iraq in the Marine Corps, when we ran into the British, and we did, they were there fighting with us. That's worth pointing out. They had standard optics on their weapons, and we did not as Americans. That came later. That came my second tour in Iraq. Our first tour as an infantry marine, we did not have optics. I had an old beat-up M16A2. The British had optics on their rifle. It looks like the SA-80 comes standard with an optic. How good that optic is, I don't know, but it's probably a distinct advantage over iron sights. Worth pointing out. It's also worth pointing out that, in my opinion, and this doesn't really matter for fighting, but the SA-80 looks like one of the ugliest weapons for an infantry rifle I've ever seen. But I wouldn't care if it worked well and worked reliably. and it had a good optic on it. So who knows? Now let's talk about another one of our likely allies, I hope. Israel. Now, Israel uses heavily the M4 platform, but I believe its official infantry rifle is going to be the Tavor. The Tavor is a fine rifle. When I was the commander of a tactical team, I employed all number of people with different backgrounds, but quite a few of them were IDF, Israeli Defense Force guys, and they were familiar with the Tavor. I let them get Tavors and have Tavors if they liked them, and it seems like a good weapon. I have so many years on an M4 pattern and those ergonomics and the reloads and everything else. For me, I don't think I would pick it, but again, if I grew up on bullpups, the Tavor is a fantastic weapon. It's probably, in my opinion, and I've never obviously fired the top secret squirrel, or do they have squirrels in China? I don't know. I assume they have some kind of squirrel in China, some kind of tree-dwelling rodent, but whatever. Having not ever fired that one, all the bullpups I know, if I go to war with a bullpup, and again, I wouldn't want to, if I had to go to war with a bullpup right now, from what I know, I'd probably pick the Tavor. It is a great weapon. And the Israelis are known for using all manner of different weapons and guns that they can get their hands on. They likely have a large number of M4s. Many of them probably came initially from the US. And it looks like they have a number of pistols, but the first one, the Glock 19, that's kind of, known for being the epitome of a good combat handgun. Why it didn't win the US military handgun trials recently, I don't know. But it's a good handgun. That is as much as I don't like Glocks for me personally, for an army, for a standing military force, I think it's a fine choice. It also lists a Browning high power, good reputation for a long time, and the SIG 226, which is actually my carry gun, which is what I have on my hip right now. So they're doing pretty good in the handgun department. All those are in 9 para. And it looks like the British military also uses a Glock, the Glock 17 Gen 4, which is a fine weapon, and kind of known for the epitome of a rugged, reliable combat handgun. Not my favorite, but it probably honestly would be what I would arm a fighting force with. They're so forgiving of neglect. Now let's forget about fantasy football. Is that really going to affect your life, assuming you don't bet a ridiculous amount of money on it? Who wins whatever game? I prefer the term thought experiment. So let's do one that might actually help us out survive as men, provide and protect those. Step up and be a man and protect the widow and the orphan and the fatherless. Let's say World War III has broken out. Let's say, sadly, that New York and DC and LA are nuclear wastelands. Yeah, not as fun as fantasy football, right? Again, I want peace, but prepare for war. Let's say things have gotten that bad. Let's say just like George Washington and the Continental Army, he needs a group of militia. They need a group of militia because the standing army, the Marine Corps, is on so many fronts and is stretched so thin. They need militia. They need strong, able-bodied alpha males to step up and defend the country. Let's say, before the Battle of Portland, how about the Battle of Boise? It has a nice ring to it. You're being conscripted. They're going to throw you on a train, but you have to show up with what you're going to fight with. They're out of guns and ammo. They're issued to the regular standing military. You got to bring what you got. The first question is, as a man, could you even do that? Could you even equip yourself to fight for your country and for your family and for your nation? Could you stand up as a man? That's the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia. Doesn't mean government regulation as I understand its initial language. It means well-trained, well-armed militia. That means you, their alpha male. Could you stand up as an alpha male and protect this country from enemies foreign and domestic? If you could, again, this thought experiment, you were going to the Battle of Boise. were hopping on a train. You had to equip yourself. You were going to report and be there in 3 days to fight an epic battle for the interior of the U.S. Number one, could you? Number two, what would you bring? What rifle, handgun, armor, if any, would you bring? Could you bring? Number one, do you have it? If not, why not? And if you'd want something else, why don't you have that thing? I get economics and this thing and that thing. If you have 10 guns in the safe and none of them is one that you would bring, perhaps you should have 3 guns in the safe and get the one that you would bring. Again, there's a whole other podcast called Gunfighter Life. It's not called Gun Collector Life. It's called Gunfighter Life. Whatever you would want, if we're pretending that World War III is happening tomorrow or next week, you might want that gun. You might want a decent kit, meaning boots. Super important. A rucksack. Super important. To be able to eat. Because the militias may or may not get supplied with food. So, thought experiment. What would you bring and could you bring it? Meaning, do you have it? How about pause and chew on that for a minute? Alright, hopefully that has been a motivation to you alpha males. And again, I hope that we never see World War III. I hope that none of us are peeing in radiators or fighting the battle for Boise or the battle for Omaha or whatever. Let's hope that day never comes. Let's pray that that day never comes. With that, your tactical tip of the day. You know, I do believe historically more soldiers die from infection and disease than gunshot wounds. So as tactical as your Scar 17 is, that's great. It's a great weapon. You're not going to be too tactical if you're bent over dying of dysentery. You need to have some other stuff in your kit like iodine, water purification tablets. Dirty water kills, and a lot of times a nastier death than a bullet. So just right now, it's so easy. You can literally go to Walmart and get a bottle of water purification tablets. I was just before this podcast drinking out of my metal canteen, and in a little side pocket, there's water purification tablets. In my EDC, literally in my pocket right now, attached to my EDC knife. That's how important I think it is. I have a little titanium container that holds 10 water purification tablets. Because I often will be like, I've got a few hours, I'm going to go walk around the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. And maybe that turns into an overnight trip. For whatever reason it has before. Clean water, the ability to clean wounds. That's important. That's your tactical tip of the day. Get some iodine or water purification tablets. That needs to be part of your line 1 gear, I think. At least line 2 gear. You do find yourself in a camp with a bunch of people and things like that. Again, historically, disease and dirty water has been a big thing. Don't think that things can't get so bad that happens again. So have a way on your own to purify water. You think this is an out-of-date problem? Well, I'll tell you, when I was in Iraq, there was a time when our convoys were getting bombed and IED'd so bad we didn't get regular resupply of water. Resupply of water in the deserts of Iraq is a big deal. Anyway, I'm going to stop harping on that. You get the idea. Water purification tablets are cheap. You can also make some super concentrated solution to clean wounds. I'm not a doctor, but I'd much rather do that than die of gangrene. Anyway, I'm not going to harp on that anymore. Let's go to the tactical verse of the day. Now, if you don't know, the Lord is a man of war. It says so in Exodus 15. He gives rules for warfare, a lot of them. One of them I'm going to mention here because it ties into the tactical tip. You might even call this war logistics from the Lord to his people. And you shall have a spade among your tools, and it shall be that when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it and turn and cover your excrement. Actually, I should read that verse preceding because that's equally important. Also, you shall have a place outside the camp where you may go out, and you shall have an implement among your equipment, and when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it and turn and cover your refuse. That's the New King James. That's generally my go-to translation. Again, because sanitation is important. And if you were in the infantry, in the Marine Corps, in the Army, you probably did that with an E-tool. There's a reason you get issued an E-tool. And especially during the invasion, we didn't have bases per se. We fought our way forward in the day, and we dug a fighting hole and slept in it at night. Anyway, that's your very practical, tactical verse of the day. With that, thanks for listening. Have a blessed day. This was initially recorded in the year of our Lord, 2022, on the 3rd day of October.